As you are joining, we're wanting to express our thanks for your time and your interest in this topic today, and inviting you to get settled, because I'm going to hand to Thea from the Centre for Public Impact to acknowledge country.
Thanks, Kerry, and thanks everyone for being here today. It's wonderful to see some familiar faces and also some new ones as well. I would like to acknowledge that I'm joining you today from the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, land that was never ceded. And it feels really important to call out the connection of this acknowledgement to the topic of this webinar, which is about trauma, a topic which is so deeply connected with the experience of First Nations people in this place as a result of colonisation. Acknowledging and reckoning with this trauma feels like a huge part of what we need to be doing as a country, and having a conversation about collective healing in the year that the referendum is taking place in Australia feels particularly important. So with that as our framing, I want to acknowledge traditional custodians and recognise their continuing connection to the land and waters within and around this place and the places where you're joining from today. I pay my respects to elders past and present, who hold the memories, the traditions, the culture, and the hopes of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders peoples. And I'd like to invite all of you who are joining us today to, in the chat, acknowledge where you're joining us from today. And I'll hand back to Kerry now to give you a sense of what we're going to be doing together for the next hour and a half today.
Thanks so much, Thea. And as we begin, I want to acknowledge Convene families of the Yugambeh language group of the land that I live and work on. So as you're acknowledging the country you're from, I'll just take us to our purpose today. Today, we are gathering together to introduce a lens to our work, to introduce systemic trauma as a lens through which we can see our work, and to couple that with collective healing as a practice that may enable us to transform the systems that we work within. So as we move through this purpose together, we just wanted to share what the flow will be like, because there's some moments in the next hour and a half where we will ask things of you. So very soon we're going to introduce you to John and Laura from the Collective Change Lab, and they're going to introduce systemic trauma as a lens and collective healing as a practice. We're going to then ask you, as people listening and engaging with that, to just where are these concepts, these ideas resonating with you? Ashley Morris will then share a story of systems change that he's leading in Victoria, and John and Laura will join with him at the end of his story to reflect on it using the lens of systemic trauma and a practice of collective healing. Daniel and Morgan will then offer their reflections on what they've heard and experienced today, and particularly how a systemic lens and collective healing may apply in their work. And lastly, we'll return to you with a very short poll to understand what of this practice, what of these concepts have landed with you, what might you want to learn more about, and most importantly, inviting you into an ongoing conversation if this resonates with you. And we'll close with thanks. So hopefully that overviews the time together today, and I'll pass back to Thea to introduce John and Laura to you.
Thanks, Kerry. So we've got some amazing speakers today, and the two who are going to open are probably names that are familiar to a lot of you. John Kania and Laura Calderon de la Barca. John is a visionary social sector leader with a passion for inspiring and empowering others to create transformational change. Over the last 30 years, John has been a practitioner, a researcher, a writer, a teacher, and a speaker on how organisations and people can achieve change together. John is currently the Executive Director of the Collective Change Lab, a non-profit that innovates with approaches to radical collaboration that support human development and social and environmental progress. John is a co-author of some really groundbreaking articles in the Stanford Social Innovation Review, many I'm sure of which you've read, Collective Impact, which is the most read SSIR article ever, The Dawn of System Leadership, the relational work of systems change as well. John is also the co-author of The Water of Systems Change, which is used by lots of people, including us at CPI, to support people to understand how social change happens. Laura is a psychotherapist who specialises in collective trauma as well as collective healing. She is also a researcher, an educator, a consultant, a linguist, and a cultural analyst. Besides Laura's private therapeutic practice, she also collaborates with research and facilitation in the Academy of Inner Science and Pocket Project, and she is part of collective healing courses and programs such as the Collective Trauma Summits, where she participates as a panelist and host, bringing particularly the wisdom of Latin American voices to thousands of people across a global audience. Laura also facilitates groups for global majority participants in the collective healing journey, trauma-informed leadership course, and timeless wisdom training. And Laura leads her own workshops on trauma healing and has worked in Canada and Mexico, particularly with Indigenous communities, and consults for a diversity of NGOs and institutions on trauma healing. So you can hear we've got some deep expertise in the Zoom room with us today. And with those introductions done, I'd now love to hand to John to hear from you. So thank you, John.
Great, thank you, Thea. It's great to be with you and great to be with everybody. So grateful for this opportunity to connect on this really, really important topic. So I'd love to begin with the origin story of how this session came to be. For the past 2 years, my colleagues and I at the Collective Change Lab have been exploring how best to support transformational change in communities. And a key finding from our work is that a critical factor that prevents communities from transforming is trauma. In fact, we believe that when communities feel stymied in making progress, it's often because their systems are stuck, psychically, physically, and spiritually. So this notion of stuckedness can be used to describe the majority of systems in the modern world, I believe. And we also believe that a major source of the stuckedness is unresolved and unintegrated trauma that limits both the individual's ability and the system's ability to thrive. And we believe the converse is also true, that to the degree that trauma in the system is resolved and integrated, the process of healing can produce tremendous energy and creativity, bringing regeneration to communities, opening up new and untapped potential. So when there's attention paid to healing individual and systemic trauma, what seems so incredibly difficult for communities to do to become more equitable and more just can become easier. And we're beginning to see glimmers of this actually happening in the world in places like Canada and here in Australia through the truth, reconciliation, and healing processes that are taking place with Indigenous peoples. So for the rest of this webinar, we're going to sort of explore the path from trauma to healing to systems change. But before going there, Laura, it would be great if you could help us get centered in this exploration.
I'd be delighted to, my dear John, and welcome everyone from my side as well. Thank you so much for being here with us today. And I would like to invite you to take a moment and find a comfortable position for your body. And start by taking a deeper breath. And if you feel comfortable closing your eyes, if not, that's totally fine. And on the out breath, soften as you allow the air out, and then take another deeper breath inside. And start to focus your attention on the here and now, letting go of whatever it is that you were doing right before. And noticing your sensations. Another deeper breath in. Notice how your ribcage expands and how it softens and contracts as you exhale. Take one more deeper breath in and start to notice the sensations of aliveness in your body. Streaming sensations of life within you. And start welcoming those sensations. And include also any tension, any discomfort, maybe even pain that you might have in your body. Let that be here too, and welcome that. And take another deeper breath and notice also if there's any sensations of numbness, any part of your body that you can't feel very well. And welcome that as well. And now gently glide your attention over to your emotional landscape. And notice what emotions might be present right now for you. Notice how intense or how subtle they are. Notice if they move or if they stay the same as you bring your attention to them. And gently welcome them, whether they're pleasant or unpleasant, whether you like to have them or not. Just allow them to be here and feel us welcoming them also. Take another deeper breath and bring your attention now to your mental landscape. And notice what is present in your mind, if there's many thoughts or few thoughts, if they're moving very quickly, if there's more space, if there is more space between one thought and the next thought. Notice if your mind is running in circles or if it's more open, maybe with curiosity. And then take a moment to gently rest in the space between the thoughts, allowing yourself to just be here now for a moment. And feel yourself welcome by this team of people who are happy that you're here today. And before bringing us back to our present moment, take a moment to feel what brought you here. What in your life do you care about enough to be spending this time? And feel us welcome that which matters to you as well. Now take another deeper breath. And when you're ready, gently open your eyes. And over to you, John.
Thank you, Laura. Thank you for creating that space and that opening. So you and I have the pleasure of spending the next, I guess, 15 minutes or so in conversation. And there's a lot I know you're going to share about the topic around trauma and healing, collective healing and systems change. But maybe just a place to start would love to hear how you came to the work of trauma and collective healing.
Thanks, John. Sure. I came to it out of my own need. As a youngster, I used to feel tremendous social anxiety, and I thought that there was something terribly wrong with me and that I was defective, even if I did really well at school and had a stable and loving family. Over time, I came to realize that as much as there was something that I personally did need to heal, a part of what was happening to me had to do with being a Mexican mestiza, that is, a person who's part indigenous, part European, in a country that despises indigenous people and culture. I realized, in other words, that Mexico needs to heal. So my PhD thesis, which, by the way, I did in Australia at the University of Western Sydney, I created a therapeutic session for my country, for Mexico. I finished that in 2007. And since then, I continued my own healing journey, which has been my greatest teacher, where I learned about trauma, about different healing modalities, and how the body, relationships, nature, spirituality, art, culture can help us overcome trauma.
Wow. Wow. Well, we could stay with that all day, but it's okay. I'm going to move on because we next want to talk about the trauma. Trauma is a really complex topic, and it'd be great if you could ground us with the important ways that trauma shows up in our society.
Yes, trauma is a huge topic. So to make the most of our time, I have simplified the information to just bring what I consider are the most essential aspects of it. So I'm leaving out important information, and I just want to name and acknowledge that. So let's start with the basics. What is trauma? So trauma can be understood as an invisible, unhealed wound and our reaction to it. It is caused originally by an overwhelming event like a car crash, or a series of events like being repeatedly bullied at school, or enduring conditions like colonialism or racism, for which we do not have enough resources to cope. That is, if we do have resources to cope, then the same event will not become traumatizing for us. Trauma is therefore not only something that happened in the past, because the overwhelming experience is still undigested and unintegrated. The reaction then stays active in our bodies, our psyches, and our relationships. It feels as if the threat of overwhelm were still present in the current reality, because the energy and information of the experience are still alive inside of us, even if they are not alive in our current environment. By telling our body that we are still at risk, trauma becomes the lens through which we relate and which impacts our capacity to clearly perceive and effectively engage with the present reality. Why does this happen, you may ask? So the fundamental task of all trauma responses is to help us survive overwhelm. For example, my mother broke her wrist, and when I saw her severely fractured hand, my whole torso completely contracted inside, and I went completely numb emotionally. Now, that allowed me to stay present in the emergency room to get her emergency surgery. After the surgery, I was able to call a friend, and only then did my emotions flow again as I cried on the phone. In that moment, the fragmenting off of my overwhelming emotions through that contraction was crucial for me to be able to stay present and resolve the situation. That is the intelligence of trauma. Now, trauma has different scales of expression. To understand them, we have found the concept of fractals useful. So the next slide, please, Carrie. Most of us have seen fractals in nature, in the structures of ferns, of broccoli, in the spirals of shells, and in the spirals of galaxies. Fractals are a self-similar structure with different scales of manifestation. And using this metaphor, today we will look at individual, intergenerational, collective, and systemic dimensions of trauma, starting with individual trauma. So the next slide, please, Carrie. At an individual level, trauma activates our autonomic nervous system through the well-known reactions of fight, flight, and freeze that occur largely out of our conscious awareness. To ensure survival, trauma filters our perceptions of the present through a lens of overwhelm and threat, which affects our engagement with reality, particularly with our relationships. Trauma shows up in a range of expressions, going to name just a couple for each: hyperreactivity and control for fight, fragmentation and denial for flight, and paralysis and numbness for freeze. Next slide, please. Intergenerational trauma occurs when one or more of our ancestors experiences trauma and is unable to heal it before having children. The symptoms are passed on through various mechanisms: insecure attachment processes, relational dynamics in the family, and physiologically through epigenomic encoding that affects DNA expression. According to Native US American and Canadian First Nations accounts, trauma can be transmitted for up to 7 generations. Research has demonstrated transmission for up to 6 in the epigenetic research of transgenerational trauma transmission that Isabelle Mansuy carries out with mice in the Zurich Polytechnic. Some real-world examples: symptoms such as obesity in 2nd and 3rd generation offspring from mothers and grandmothers in Holland who were pregnant and survived the hunger winter at the end of World War II, and severe depression in children and grandchildren of Holocaust survivors. Next slide, please. Collective trauma can be understood as the population level impacts of a catastrophic event or process that disrupts the basic structures and systems a community or society has created to sustain its way of life. During and after a collective trauma, the flow of activities is interrupted, resources that we normally have access to are unavailable or destroyed, and the result is an experience of fragmentation, isolation, overwhelm, disorientation, and even dehumanization. Examples: the lingering impacts of the COVID pandemic in children, healthcare workers, the economic system, and a very big etc. Also, the historic structural racism and precarious life conditions experienced by Black people, Indigenous people, and so many other oppressed communities in the world, which keeps getting reproduced today, too often unacknowledged by privileged populations that have and continue to profit from those conditions. The journey to heal from trauma starts with becoming aware of its presence. This applies to every expression of trauma. And John, you might want to say something about the conclusions that we had before I move on to.
Well, you know, I think what we're in the process of exploring is, you know, as Laura said, we see these individual expressions of trauma and intergenerational and collective trauma. And we also see that happening at a systemic level. And you know, why? Because if people are traumatized and people make up systems, and systems are traumatized. And so, you know, this is an area of examination for us because we feel like it's one that's not really, you know, being brought to the fore in discussions of sort of how do we move towards health? How do we move towards thriving? And so I wonder, and we're actually writing an article, Laura and I, and another colleague, Catherine Milligan, about this notion of systemic trauma. And Laura, perhaps you want to say some words about how we're going about it and thinking about it.
Yes, well, first, you know, how to think of trauma at the systems level. It can be defined as the combination of the carryover of individual, intergenerational, and collective trauma that actors in the system bring into it. And that would be the traumatized side of the system, plus the new trauma that is created by interactions between actors and sometimes also components of the system as they engage in interaction with each other. And that would be the traumatizing side of the system. Some examples, lack of collaboration between different actors within the same system who know they have the same objectives, but refuse to engage with each other, or system actors with power, not directly relating to marginalized system actors for a more effective and more efficient life experience-informed decision-making process. Or when someone in the organization gets so swamped with red tape as they attempt to navigate the system that they become overwhelmed and cannot deliver on the results. And where do we find trauma in systems? It exists in all levels of the system, but is particularly insidious in relationships, power dynamics, and mental models. In that sense, having awareness of the most common trauma responses at an individual level helps us recognize similar expressions at a systemic level. You ask why it is such a critical lens for systems change. A trauma lens can help us understand how trauma impairs the system's functioning and ability to fulfill its mandate, in spite of having well-intentioned, well-trained people and ample funding. The understanding a trauma lens can bring may help create new conditions for interactions that reconnect people and enable breakthrough results. And finally, there's multiple reasons why this is important. Our world is facing unprecedented crises of existential severity. We absolutely need large-scale collaboration and collective intelligence to address them. Trauma is a core obstacle to this. To heal trauma collectively will require a profound transformation in all of us and our systems. Unless we address trauma, I think it is unlikely that we will be able to resolve the problems using the same mindset that created them, one shaped by trauma. Besides, trauma is also a gateway to some of the most profound transformations I have witnessed in people, including in myself. So when I see the amazing results that become available for us, even as individuals, how much more may become available for us collectively if we manage to address this? That thought inspires me.
And, you know, I think this can easily, at least for me, become overwhelming when we start to think about addressing trauma at a systems level and trying to do so collectively. Yet one of the things that gives me hope is this really growing movement that you're a part of around collective healing. So can you say a little bit about that? Is that, you know, just one big group therapy, or because it's an amazing, you know, sort of it's a movement, but it just the work that is happening that we've been able to connect with people on is really just profound. And I know you've been working in the collective healing space for a while, so I'd love if you could say a little bit about it. Also maybe ground it, give us an example.
Sure. Collective healing is a broad term for a practice that covers a huge variety of formats and expressions. Again, I'll have to simplify, so I'll provide 3 very brief examples just to identify some essential aspects of it. So one very well-known format is healing circles. They provide a horizontal structure where facilitators create a safe and intimate environment. In one version, people share experiences they might have kept to themselves out of pain, shame, or fear, and are received with care, compassion, and respect by the circle. With each share, a collective unburdening and restoration of dignity and belonging begins to occur, impacting all participants. Many Indigenous communities the world over have true mastery of using circles for healing. Collective healing can also happen in a Zoom call with hundreds of participants, excuse me, and a facilitator working with one individual whose process becomes the focal point for healing to become collective as it touches many others who share a similar wound. And finally, collective healing can also happen through quote-unquote improbable conversations as people from different parts of the system that normally are not in touch or may even have adversarial positions come together to connect, listen to each other, exchange information, and through that issues start to get addressed that are normally too hot to handle. Now, drawing from these, I'll share 2 essential aspects that distinguish, in my understanding, collective from individual healing. The first one is collective resonance, which as the, excuse me, I'll just grab a little bit of water here. So collective resonance, which as the original term, which comes from acoustic, conveys, refers to a phenomenon where the movement of emotional energy in one subject generates movement of a similar quality of emotional energy in others within a collective. This way, one person sharing vulnerably in a safe space, that is where they are not being shamed because of their vulnerability, can touch a wound that is common to others, and all those who have that resonance can be held by the presence and compassion of the field. And with the help of our mirror neurons and our capacity for empathy and for attunement, a collective vicarious healing can happen. The second aspect is having individual and collective dimensions of our experience receive healing simultaneously. So collective aspects are harder to heal individually precisely because they have a collective nature. If as your therapist, I tell you that you have nothing to be ashamed of for having a certain wound that is common to us, this will not have nearly the impact as seeing others share about this same wound in a collective setting and see then the rest of the people receive them with compassion. With many people witnessing, a door opens to change our collective consciousness that in time can forge new, more wholesome collective agreements.
Thank you. That's beautiful. Yeah, so I mean, you've described a bunch of different modalities. So it's not just one way of doing collective healing, but some overall principles about returning, repairing, integrating, allowing people to move forward, allowing systems to move forward as a collective healing is a way of helping us do that. So yeah, I guess the last thing I'll say, and then I think we'll move on, is first of all to thank you for the work you're doing in the world and for sharing with us today. And also just, I think in our collective work together, part of what we're hoping to do is what we've observed, CCL, Collective Change Lab, as we've gotten into this arena, is that there is this amazing world of people that are doing trauma and healing work and collective healing work. And then there are people that are involved in, I'll say, social change or social impact work. And the two worlds are not all that well connected right now. And I think there lies a terrific opportunity for us going forward. And that's one thing that gives me hope in this work. So thank you again, Laura, for your wonderful words. And I think I will turn it back to Thea.
Thanks, John. And yeah, just to echo, thanks to Laura and thanks to both of you for that wonderful sort of introduction to some of the concepts and ideas that you've been exploring separately and together. What we'd love to do now is just hear some of your reflections from the participants today. So Jess is going to drop into the chat a link. And the question is, what's resonating for you so far from what you've heard? So just drop in a word or two or three around the words that represent some of what you're taking away from what you've heard. We'll just have about 30 seconds or so of silence while you work into that Mentimeter. It's interesting, we're seeing lots of different words come up, which means that people have taken away very different messages, and that collective resonance and collective healing, and the word collective is really showing up in the center of that word cloud there, which is wonderful, because I think that that's what's so unique about the work that you're doing, that it is moving beyond the conversation about the individual and expanding it into the collective and the system. So feel free to keep adding to that, Menti, but we might stop there, and I'm going to hand back to Kerry now to introduce our next contributor. Thanks, Kerry.
Thanks so much, Thea. And in that word cloud, what just jumped out for me was somebody wrote, "Healing is contagious," which is beautiful. Look, I have the great honour now to introduce you to Ashley Morris. Now, Ashley is a Gundit Mara man, and he is the inaugural Koori Service Coordinator for the Children's Court of Victoria here in Australia. Ashley initially developed and implemented a Koori Hearing Day within that court, but it's grown over time to become Naram Nagala Gunbu. And I'm going to hand over to Ashley to share his story of how he has changed a court system in a state in Australia. Ashley, over to you.
Thank you, Kerry, and thank you to everyone for jumping online to listen to us talk today. Like Kerry said, I'm a Gunduj Mara man, which is Southwest Victoria. I just lost the screen for a second, sorry. And working for the Children's Court for the last 6 or 7 years. I'm currently up in Shepparton today. We celebrated the 2-year anniversary of the Shepparton Maramnilla Gumbu this morning. And just pay my respects to the Yorta Nations while I'm up here on their land. I've worked with courts for some time. I started my career with the courts in 2011. I finished school, worked at a local Aboriginal co-op up in Albury Wodonga, the border of Victoria and New South Wales, and quickly moved into youth justice. I then moved down to Melbourne, which is where my career started with courts. I was a Koori Court officer, which deals with criminal matters. Koori people are pleading guilty and being sentenced through a culturally appropriate process. For the next 6 or 7 years, I held a number of positions within the court, generally around the criminal space, whether it's children's court, magistrates court, bail, supervised bail, that sort of thing. But in 2016, I was lucky enough to get a job with the Children's Court, where my role was to develop and implement a culturally appropriate process or way of doing things for child protection matters in Victoria, which I swore I would never work in child protection for the reasons Laura spoke about, in terms of, intergenerational traumas leading to traumatized systems. It's a very difficult place for First Nations people to work in, just with the cultural load and the vicarious trauma that comes along with it. I swore I would never work in child protection, but I was a little bit annoyed with my previous employer, and it was time to move on. It was the only thing that popped up. So I did see it as a bit of a bridge, a gap gap year, try something new and see how we go, but instantly fell in love with the work we do. In Victoria, Australia, we have the Aboriginal Justice Agreement, which is a partnership between community and government to respond to the 333 recommendations of the Royal Commission to Aboriginal Deaths in Custody from '91. And through that Aboriginal Justice Agreement, which was formed in 2000, we got our criminal career courts, which started in 2002 at Shepparton, and then they went to Broadmeadows, which is a suburb of Melbourne, and to now it's almost got complete statewide reach across 3 jurisdictions: the County Court, the Magistrates Court, and the Children's Court, which is fantastic. The Aboriginal Justice Agreement is governed by what we call the Aboriginal Justice Forum, which is where quarterly community meet with government leads to address justice issues. And in 2009, the community said it's fantastic that we have our career courts, our prison liaison officers, our police liaison officers, but what we're missing is a culturally appropriate process for child protection matters. And if we get it right there, we might not need our career courts, we might not need prison officers, because if we keep our kids connected and safe in their identity and community, regardless of their placement, we should have no need for a criminal career court. So that was in 2009 when that was asked. That was the year I finished school, and nothing really happened until 2016. The Children's Court received some funding to build a new court to try new things in the family division in the northern suburbs of Melbourne at Broadmeadows. So there was a pool of funding to try new things. Our then president of the Children's Court, Judge Amanda Chambers, said we have far too many kids coming into our court who are Aboriginal and basically getting a bad outcome because we aren't paying enough attention to things like the Aboriginal Child Placement Principle or the importance of connection to culture, community or land for career kids. So the Children's Court assigned that pool of funding to employ me to develop and implement a career hearing day. Like I said, I was there for a short time just to fill a gap because I was annoyed at where I was coming from. And on my first day, I was very much regretting my choices. I had 2 elders who I've looked up to my whole life, dragged out by the police security for an overspill of emotions because the process at court and child protection was just too much. It brought up the past of their upbringing, being stolen members themselves, coming to a court to fight for their future generations who are continually removed at a higher rate than non-Aboriginal children. So I had my work cut out for me. I spent a lot of time in the first couple of months with community and families and said, what can we do to make court more accessible, a better place for you guys to come and talk business to make sure your children are safe. And for all the families I sat with, I reckon they all said, get rid of the court, get rid of the magistrate, get rid of the department and get rid of the lawyers. And, in a court environment, there's probably 4 non-negotiables. So I had a fair task ahead of me. But if you look at it through the lens of, what happened in this country, forced removal, attempted genocide, I was tasked with a pretty big job making court a friendly place. How was I, as an Aboriginal person, to stand at the doors of a courthouse to say you are safe to come into this building and have this conversation, taking into account the intergenerational trauma that comes with First Nations affected by colonisation. And what we come up with was Maramnala Gumbu, which translates to "we are one" in the local Wurrung language. I went to the Land Council and said, this is what we're trying to do. This is what we want to achieve in terms of making sure voices are heard for the decision maker to make a culturally informed decision around placement and safety. And the elders said Maramnala Gumbu, which translates to "we are one." They said, you're all there for the same reason, and that's the best interests of the child to ensure their safety, regardless of their placement. We know not all kids get to go home with mum and dad, but we know that culture is a mechanism of safety and reduces the harm for Aboriginal young people. The model is it's no new laws. There's no legislative change. I'm not a lawyer by any means, but I had a look in the Children, Youth and Families Act. And there's a section in there that says a magistrate can conduct proceedings in a way that suits the needs of the parties. And that was my light bulb moment to say that there is nothing stopping this system from doing things to suit the needs of the parties. But far too long, we did it to suit the needs of lawyers or judicial officers or government departments. There was no, are you okay to have this conversation? It was, there's an application and an order needs to be made, let's make it happen. There was no, how would you like to keep your children safe? And in the Koori or Aboriginal lenses, how would you like to keep your community safe? There was no elders involved, there was no extended families involved. So what we come up with was around the table. So I'm not sure if many of you have been to court, but the sort of typical court setup is there's a bench where the magistrate sits up the top. There's a bar table in the middle where the lawyers sit, and then there's the gallery where either the accused or their family sit. And what happens in mainstream court is you come to court, you wait for 4 hours, the lawyer finally comes down and talks to you, and as you're talking to them, your case gets called in and you have to run in and sit in that gallery and watch someone up on a bench look down at someone on a bar table while you're floating in the gallery. And these people talk about your life and where your future will be. And it's just not the Koori way of doing things. So we threw that all out the door based off that little section in the Act I found, and invite family, extended family, service providers, lawyers, and the magistrate to sit around an oval bar table and have a conversation, as opposed to a court hearing. This is about self-determined outcomes in a judicial environment to ensure that cultural connections are maintained through the right people. You look at cultural support plans that are written by government departments or Aboriginal orgs. It's a fantastic setup. However, the people that hold that knowledge are sitting in the courtroom. Let's hear from them. Let's hear from who's around and what the families have been doing. And that's what Maramela Gumbu is. It's an adapted court setting that is Koori centered, Koori focused, and case managed. So attached to the program, there is a Koori services coordinator whose role is to herd the cats to get them in the courtroom, making sure the right people are in the room at the right time for the right decision to be made. And it's quite an intense task, but they do a wonderful job, our Koori service coordinators across both locations. We also have Koori family support officers whose roles are just to support families before, during, and after court. I still catch up with families from 2016 that we finalised on 5 or 6 years ago. The court has no longer has this feeling of a bad place where you go to jail or have your children removed. It's a place where you go to get support, and that's evident through mob just popping in to see how we're going. It's weird. I mean, I struggle to get up and go to court every day, and I'm getting paid to be there. But these fellas will pop in, see how you going, ask how the magistrate is, ask how the child protection worker is, and then off they go to do their business, which is phenomenal for a court. We've also got our judicial officers. We have some really wonderful magistrates who sit in Maramela Gumbu, and they learn a lot from us around cultural, not cultural advice, but the family setups and community setups, because our roles are a designated role, so they must be filled by Aboriginal people. And another really, really important piece to the puzzle is the Department of Families, Fairness and Housing's Child Protection. They provide us with a practice leader, because what was happening before we had a practice leader is me and now my team were getting families ready and understanding the court conditions and making sure they were happening. But when the department weren't doing it, we couldn't get a foot in the door. It was like, I'm not sure if you guys have kids or not, but it's like telling your kids to clean up their room. They'll do it when they're ready, not when you want it done. So we asked the department to give us a practice leader, and that role was to help move the department side of things. So what we do with families, getting people in the door, the practice leader does that. So hey, we need the team leader here or the case planner here because we're going to ask this question. Or it could be, you know, none was asked to be supervised as a carer or a, you know, to supervise visits. That hasn't been done. Why hasn't it been done? We've got court in 3 weeks and you know you're going to get slammed by the magistrate to do it. That's that case management approach. Now, the magistrates themselves, we have a docketing system which we trialled out at Broady, which is now across all children's court specialist locations where it's 1 case per magistrate. So most times, the people who know the most about the case are the family and the magistrates. The lawyers will change, the worker will change, but the family and the magistrate are saying, no, we were here last week and this is what was said. Why are you changing the goalposts? It's hard enough as is. This isn't the conversation. We started in Broady, and then went to Shep. Like I said, we celebrated our 2-year of Shepparton today, which was a really wonderful event. Broady sits weekly. We list about 10 to 12 matters a day. Shepparton sits fortnightly, and same thing, we list about 10 to 12 matters a day. And yeah, if you guys are ever in Victoria, I can talk the ears off a tree about how good it is. Feel free to reach out and come check it out. It's quite a special thing to observe, and that's the best way to get your head around it. The child protection, I suppose the system, the whole lot, it's a stark difference between, you know, offices where they don't have a Maramnella Gumby versus offices where we do around cultural support plans, adherence to child placement principles, and even just the way we do things. And my role now has sort of morphed over the years, and I'm currently looking at how do we expand this program, and how do we look at running a First Nations led, designed and delivered program influence the way we do the mainstream. Our magistrates in Broadmeadows found the Koori way of doing things the best way of doing things and took this approach to all matters in Broadmeadows. The pandemic kind of squashed that. Obviously, we can't send 40 people around the bar table in the middle of the pandemic, so we're not back to that stage yet at Broady, but we're getting there. That's a really brief overview. I think Thea and Kerry are going to send out the evaluation. I strongly recommend you guys have a quick flip of that, particularly the last half of that evaluation. It talks about people's experiences with courts, and there's some really good quotes on there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ashley. Thea and Jess have popped those links into the chat for those that are already in there and looking at them. And Ash, prepare to be inundated now that you've invited all these good folk to come and visit you.
I've also put in the chat a couple of photos of the courtroom in Broady and Shepparton, if you want to have a quick squeeze at that.
I would love to. Thank you very much. At this stage, I'm going to invite John and Laura to step into conversation with Ash about what they heard in his story around the systemic trauma lens and the opportunity of collective healing.
Ashley, well, I would love to start by congratulating you on such a beautiful job, particularly because it was initially really hard for you to join this system, but it feels to me like this kind of movement where somebody who, belongs to the group of people who have been impacted and who have the awareness of what is not working. I mean, that lived experience is just so crucial for a system to really transform in an effective way. So that's one of the things that I heard, just how important your presence has been. I also hear, the vision of the Aboriginal elders, realizing what you were doing and bringing this "we are one," as the framing for everything else that is getting done there. To me, sounds like just so important, so that it can really be culturally like they open the door for the community to engage with your efforts. And so then there could become a link, because part of what trauma does is it fragments the different parts of a system. And so part of the healing that is required is to reconnect those parts of the system. And when I look at you know, those round tables, talking about circles precisely, and the wise use that, you know, Aboriginal communities also know how to make use of that. Bringing that in and having a setting that is appropriate, that is resonant with the kind of vision that is being created, where everyone has a place at the table, where it's not somebody up there talking about my life, but I have a place, my voice can be heard. All those elements create the opportunity for relationships between people to become central in how things get resolved. And that to me feels like such a rich and important aspect of what you're bringing. And John, if you'd like to comment again, please.
Yeah, well, it's wonderful. Thank you for putting the pictures in there. I mean, just as Laura said, you know, I think when we think about systemic drama and how, you know, I think one of our goals should be, how do we shift the energy? And it feels like the program that you came up with, because you had a system there, right? You have magistrates, you have service providers, you have the family. And I mean, you talked about the visual of, you know, this sort of hierarchical, you know, being in court and shifting that to the circle. I don't know if it was intentionally a quasi round table, but, you know, I think, you know, shifting the energy in the system and the relationships between people in the system, I think is one of the things, you know, we hope to do. I'm curious, Ashley, if you might talk a little bit about, you know, have you seen healing in any way through this new structure, and healing among whom?
Just quickly before I get into the healing side of things, before we had the oval bar tables in Broadmeadows, we had a big rectangle one on wheels, and I used to turn it into a square, and it was a disaster. Family would sit here and the department would sit here, and me and the magistrate would dodge the bullets coming across one another. And I said this, and circle sentencing or circle talking is you know, something, you know, my community is doing for, you know, 75,000 plus years. And
right.
It's amazing what a bunch of round edges do to change the way people engage in a process. In terms of healing, I think we've seen just about everyone heal. I mean, Laura talked about how the systems obviously end up traumatized as well. And, you know, child protection workers don't have an easy task. And we have the VAGO report, which talks about the impacts on child protection workers, and that really informed the way we engage with child protection workers. And you know, there's some very, very strong families in the northern suburbs community and the Shepparton region that you know, renowned for their advocacy for their family and their community. And you know, there was I wouldn't say a fear, but an anxiety around, if there's a child at risk, how do we approach that? And we've seen that healing between community service providers, government orgs, and the court on how to deal with these sensitive issues. It's not a fear. It's not we know how to tackle it now. The healing with families is unbelievable. We had in Broadmeadows in the very early days, we had a mother who just wasn't ready to have her children return. And through the process, we heard her voice about where she wanted the children to live and be safe, and agree to what we call a care by secretary order, which is probably the worst order we can put a child on in this state. That's where the parental responsibility sits with the department, with the government, basically. And if you look at it through the lens of colonization and what happened in you know, the stolen generation, it's not nice for anyone. And we got her to a point where she was comfortable with that and agreed to the care by secretary order, and thanked us as a court for putting her children in out of home care, because she knew that's through engagement. She knew that place in her heart was healed through this process, knowing that she was involved in that decision. Without Marinella Gumbu, that would have went to a 20-day contest where her name as a mother would have been dragged through the mud for 20 days, and then a non-Aboriginal judicial officer would have decided where that child would be placed. And that mum, everyone was crying in the court the day that order was made, as you could imagine. And she thanked us. She said, thank you. And that's healing. That's healing we see through this process. Whereas if it was mainstream, I'm not sure where mum would have ended up. And just to wrap this story up, August last year, that mum come back to Marama Gumbu on an application to revoke the care by secretary order, and her children returned to her care with no further child protection involvement, and which is phenomenal, which is gigantic. And this mum said again, thank you for letting me be part of my children's life, because we didn't shun her out as a bad parent, a bad mum that couldn't look after her kids. We got her to a point to say, I'm not ready, but when I'm ready, I know I can walk in this door and say, give me a go. And that's the healing that comes through community. We've had, at least 1,200 families come through both Shepherd and Broadmeadows, and that story would be similar for just about every single family that comes through that door in terms of healing through a decision-making process. And I just sort of want to pump our shoes up just a little bit more. That day in August, we had 5 care by secretary orders that got converted to reunifications with parents, which is gigantic. Our magistrate, Kay McPherson, who set up the model with me in 2016, she always hates when I say this, but she's been a judicial officer for longer than I've been alive. And she said, I'd be lucky to see 5 care by secretary orders go to families in 5 years. And I've just seen it in one day. And that's the strength and healing that comes with this model. First Nations led, delivered is what's right for First Nations people. The Western systems don't work. We know that. I don't know why we keep trying it. Send it back to us. And in terms of self-determination, I think Marama Gumbu is as close as we'll get until we get our own end-to-end child protection system as it was pre-1788.
What a beautiful example you're giving us. And first of all, really to celebrate the transformation that you share with us. And I first of all, I want to highlight how I hear a change between, procedure-centered to care-centered, to really, making this process unfold through dialogue, conversation, listening, and collaboration, so that whatever happens gets created with all that input, so that, as in the case with this mom, that her voice is heard. And if, precisely, as people with trauma, we're sometimes not able to show up the way we would like to in the world, that gets seen as there's a difficulty here, not this person is difficult. That to me seems also a really essential part of the change, that the difficulties are not portrayed as a character flaw of the person, and now that's just how they are, and a label is put, and now people are dismissed, but rather as this is part of a process where mom would like to have her children, and right now she does not have those conditions to really, have them there, and therefore she can then leaning on what's being offered from a place of understanding to her, so that she can co-create the conditions for her children to be well until she can take them back. That is such a different process. And it just feels so beautiful. The other piece that I would like to highlight is, the moral injury that happens for people in a system who really want to do well by others, and who don't have the means because the trauma that's embedded in the procedures, in the way that things have been run in the system, keeps them from really being able to offer their care to the people there. And so for them, I can imagine that must have been such a transformation. And finally, there is a higher order level that is happening here, because before, this system was enacting trauma. And now there's the possibility, and it's already happening, of this system really becoming part of a solution for a longer term vision of a better life for Aboriginal people. And that is so beautiful and so inspiring. My dear Ashley, thank you.
Thank you.
Amen. John.
Yeah, I just would also highlight that when, it was lovely to hear you talk about the healing that's taken place in the system and, from a lot of different angles. And, I think often and appropriately we look to address, and try to heal the people who are impacted by the system. But then, it's people who are doing the impacting, if you will, that need to heal as well. And I think helping elevate that is a critical factor. And I think just it's beautiful the way that we are one, and in creating the circle, and that everybody's in this, and that that's the opportunity to sort of address the trauma that everybody's inflicted by, and to look at opportunities to heal, and healing through relationships. I mean, we talk about relational fault lines that happen in systems that are stuck, and I think what you begin to do is to repair those relational fault lines, and it's really pretty amazing. There's a question here that came in online that I thought I'd ask, but I also, Carrie and Thea, I don't know where we are on time. Do we have time for another question or no?
We do, John. We think that question's a big one too.
Okay, good. Well, yeah, I think there are a couple of different folks, Ashley, that have asked, what were the conditions that made this possible? Of course, you getting involved, but in the system, what were these conditions that you feel were unique? Did you have, people in magistrates and others that were just unique people that agreed to this? Or, can you talk a little bit about the context?
Yeah, the reason I was talking about the Aboriginal Justice Agreement is earlier is that we have that structure here in Victoria. We have the government are accountable to my community through an agreement that they signed to address recommendations that they requested in a report in 1991. So we have that authority here as Koori people through the Aboriginal Justice Agreement to say, this is what's going on, let us fix it. That sits behind us in Victoria. We've got that there. The judicial lead in Magistrate Kay McPherson, we would not have got anywhere without her. Without that level of championship within the organisation is a must. It has to be there. Without Magistrate McPherson, I often get the high fives and the pat on the back is the one that set up the model. But without Ms. McPherson, I would hate to see where we are. I think the statistics in Victoria show that something has to change. So there was that factor. We could lean on that pretty heavily. But in our Act, we have the Aboriginal Child Placement Principle is in our Act. And I remember I met with our judicial officers for the whole state, and I was talking about how it is their responsibility to, well, not their responsibility, but they're the judicial officers making these decisions. I talked through the increase over the past 20 years of Koori kids in out-of-home care, and they were all gobsmacked. They couldn't believe the stats were worse now than what they were when the government's policy was just forced removal. And I tied it back to, you are the people making the decision based off this Act, which says that as a last resort, an Aboriginal child person, an Aboriginal child can live with non-Aboriginal people as a last resort. Yet, why are we as a state, as a judicial system, the worst in the numbers when we're the only one that has the child place principle within our Act? And that was the real light bulb moment. It was there. It was ready to rock and roll. It just needed someone to shine the light on it. And I was fortunate enough to step in the footsteps of the giants before me to bring light to that. Our community fought hard for those principles within the Act to be there. They fought hard for the Aboriginal Justice Agreement to be entered. They fought hard to sit through and speak to the community that led to the reports of, Royal Commission into Aboriginal deaths in custody and bringing them home reports. We have a pretty solid authorising environment down here in Victoria. And more recently, there's talks of treaty for Victoria, which will give us an even better environment to ensure that there's an end-to-end safe child protection system for our community. Someone asked me was that the reason why I left my old employee? It's because completely irrelevant to trauma. I thought I deserved an opportunity they didn't give me, so I said, "Buggy is, I'm out of there." That's why I left. But yeah, just have a laugh at that one.
Thanks, Ashley. And can I come in also to thank John and Laura for reflecting with Ashley on his story. Just as we bring this part of the webinar to a close, we are acknowledging that the chat is quite full of emotion. And so we wanted to offer just a few minutes to you as listeners to process what you've heard, and to take a minute or two. If you have pen and paper, please use it. We're going to ask you to share in the chat. Just notice, what are you feeling when you've heard about systemic trauma, heard a story about the power of collective healing? Notice what's happening in your body, and think about the emotions you're feeling as something that helps us to be more skillful about how we can relate to each other as a part of healing. And we're going to play a little bit of music, just 30 seconds, a minute, for you to just tune into yourself, and then put in the chat what it is you're prepared to share about your feelings, any key insights you're having or are learning. And we'll just play those back after a few minutes. So over to you, have a think. Hopefully you had some music playing in your head as well as your own thoughts. When you're ready, please share in the chat what's sitting with you, what reactions are you noticing in yourself. Share what you feel comfortable. People are feeling a range of emotions, joy at the change, and also the despair of how much change still needs to happen. There's a lot of people feeling hopeful. Shame, very strong emotion that needs healing. People are feeling some sadness, and a knot inside themselves being lightened. Thank you. People being grateful for the learning space of deep listening. A yearning, I want this so badly. A real connection, particularly with the story of the mother that Ashley shared.
and how much pain and she must have been in. A lot of people feeling a fair bit of emotion. Please know that that's shared and balanced by hope. Someone is struck by how intuitive collective healing feels, something so human. And yet sometimes people are saying so far from what we do in our systems. There's some anger, we need more of this. And also some sense of here is the work ahead. This is the reality of the work we need to do. So we want to continue please keep adding to the chat. And we want to continue in really processing and listening to the concepts we've heard and the stories we've heard. And I'm going to hand to Thea to introduce 2 keynote listeners to share their experiences. Over to you, Thea.
Thank you, Kerry. So the idea of a keynote listener is to invite someone who's been listening in on the conversation to share back what they've heard from their perspective. So we've reached out to 2 people who were interested in listening to today to ask them to share back their reflections. The first person who we're going to be hearing from, just for a brief 5 minutes or so, is Daniel Daylight. Daniel is a proud Gamilaroi man who has family ties to the Gubbi Gubbi Nation as well. Daniel has a passion for helping Aboriginal children and youth caught in the criminal justice system. So you'll hear echoes to Ashley's work there. And he's spent his life working in the justice sector. He worked on the development of the Youth Koori Court in another part of Australia. And as part of that, consulted deeply with community and other stakeholders. Daniel is currently the manager for Just Reinvest New South Wales in Mount Druitt. He's also a director of the Redfern Aboriginal Medical Service Board and a lifelong member of the organisation. So I'm going to hand to Daniel now to share his reflections, and then I'll introduce our second keynote listener, Morgan Cataldo. Thanks, Daniel.
Yeah, hello everyone. I'm very new to the concept of a keynote listener, so let's see how this goes. But yeah, I like Ash there. I spent a lot of time. I worked for 9 years in the children's court, and it got that whole concept of, you know, that the people inside the system sometimes need to heal too was a part of that, and that was the reason we started the Youth Koori Court in New South Wales. We don't have a justice agreement up here like New South Wales is on top of Victoria for anyone who's not from Australia, but I just mean on top, you know, geographically, not, you know, in that Sydney's a better city. But we have don't have a justice agreement. We don't have a lot of things that are maybe written into legislation in Victoria. So we started a lot of therapeutic jurisprudence kind of courts at a couple of in the early 2000s. And then that disappeared. And then after working in the children's court for a long time, you see the impact of the system, because up here in the children's court, and I think it's the same across the country, but I could be wrong about this, is on one side you have the crime side, and one side you have the care side. So as the Aboriginal worker in that court, you would just, you know, go from one side to the other and be seeing kids who are getting arrested, who not long ago were removed from their family. And then that system, I worked with a fellow, Stan Small, who'd started the Children's Court Assistance Scheme back in the days, and he was on to his 3rd generation of watching the same families come through the system and seeing kids that he'd worked with as street kids have their kids removed, and then they were now having their own kids removed. So we started that to try and change something, because we understood that the whole system there was not healing at all, you know. And then to bring it back into this, I suppose, is that that was a big driver for me to get involved in that. And it's good to see what Ash doing there with that other side, which we haven't got through to New South Wales, like, you know, the care side and changing the way that happens, because we have so much knowledge and so much history of healing in our community, and in our Aboriginal ways of being and doing. So being able to bring some of that into courts and other systems is something that can really make a huge difference, because at the moment all our interactions with systems as Aboriginal people, they're all negative, mostly, I'd say 98%, because you can have a great program going and you just watch the stats get worse and worse. They've just released a report today, the Productivity Commission, Indigenous overrepresentation's going up, Indigenous people young people in out of home care has gone up. And I think that's across, all states. So it's just to that point of the collective healing part of it is, as an Aboriginal person, when you work in that system, if you're not healing yourself, you won't stay in that system, because you can't actually, it's just it can get a bit of a toxic environment sometimes, that, to your point, Ash, about not wanting to work in the care and protection system, because all the trauma that's brought to our communities. But then you also know that if you're not there, who's going to do it, and who's going to be the person? So it can take a heavy toll on that cultural load that you talked about. So just for me, and I don't know the time, I meant to set a timer, but I forgot, Carrie, is that we were going to, we've been working on a couple of things out here in Mount Druitt. But I've been involved with a couple of collective healing kind of things over the years, which would have been the youth query court, bring that community into the court. But then for me, my drive growing up in the Aboriginal Medical Service in Redfern was not to kind of make more culturally appropriate, systems. It was to try and make culturally safe communities for our mob, we don't want to make, you already have to have had trauma committed upon you by the system before the systems interact with you. If you, to get to the youth query court, you need to be convicted or found guilty of a crime. To get to care and protection in this state, I don't know how it works in Victoria, but you already have to be removed or, at that point. So you already have to have gone down that road to get that trauma before you get the healing. And so I think that's one of the things which I like about this collective healing is we should be able to heal without having to suffer through the trauma first. And so we need to design our systems in a way that do that, so that you don't have to get treatment for mental health by being suicidal. You don't have to get treatment for criminogenic risk factors by being in jail, and you can, extrapolate that to whatever system you want. But that to me is the importance of that healing, because that's how our cultures have always done it. And it's Indigenous people around the world, and it's been always our way of doing things around the circle. We never had fancy tables like you have down there in that court, maybe, but that sitting in a circle that goes across the whole world. Slowing down like we did at the start, Laura. That's what all our old people do. Like, the first few days you're out on country is all about slowing down. So all that stuff is there. I think it's just about people slowing down, listening and acting, because I've seen it happen, and it's great to hear what Ashley's doing down there. Like, our people and our communities are so much more dynamic than our systems. And so that if we can actually, heal those people and then get more people who are healed, then we can start to kind of unstuck whatever it was, unstuckedness or something. We can start to unstuck those systems, because at the moment those systems are filled with people who don't have the energy to do that work. So we need to kind of bring that healing so that they're ready to do that work, because it's going to be a lot of work.
Thank you so much, Daniel. For an inaugural keynote listener, that was a really stunning reflection, and particularly that point that you made around the, being able to heal without going through a traumatic experience was just so powerful. So thank you. I want to hand to our next keynote listener now, Morgan Cataldo, who is one of Australia's leading voices and advocates on integrating lived experience led and informed approaches into Australia's social systems. Morgan works at Berry Street as the Senior Manager Youth Engagement, and she heads up Why Change, which is a community platform for young people with lived experience to drive social, organisational and systemic change. Morgan also advises, coaches and works on strategic projects with other organisations through her independent consultancy practice. So Morgan, thank you so much for joining us today, and we'd love to hear your reflections.
Yeah, thanks. Always feel a bit weird when people call me a leading person in Australia, so I promise I didn't write that about myself. Thanks so much to Daniel too for your reflections it gave me. I was doing like clicking in the fingers in the background as you were talking. So I wrote a few notes as when I jumped in and I was listening to folks talking. And so I'll just read out some of the things that I was picking up. So the first thing was, I think it was what Laura was saying around, you know, this thing about from fragmentation to really bringing people together within the system. I think this is something we see all the time, but so much of the harm comes from decisions that are being made about people from different parts of the system, and those people never actually even interact. So, you know, re-envisioning the process and actually redesigning it with those most affected. So the power of with. And so it's something I think a lot about in my work when I do this stuff, like how do you just bring people closer together? So it's not people making decisions on behalf of people they never even met. The second thing that I guess really stood out to me was just around learning from First Nations ways. So I'm just constantly thinking to myself that the way mob does things just works better for everyone, right? Like they just get it right. They just do it better. So I wrote down around the round edges. I just really loved that around I know a lot about the circle work and the difference that round edges makes to a conversation and the way that we relate to each other. But I also just kept thinking about, you know, the shape, space and place of where healing is actually possible. So I wrote down that new frames means new ways. Yeah. So much of the way things are currently set up in systems, both physically, but also through process and the way that we relate, won't ever allow us to get to those points of healing. Like it needs to be a completely different way. And I just feel really strongly, as I'm sure many people do, that, you know, these ways really can no longer be the exception. I just get really frustrated about them always being on the margins when they're just doing it better. The third thing was around healing. So there was something someone said, and it was about, I think we think about the healing process of the thing that happens within a person, but it's like healing equals decision making. To be able to make decisions about our life and to have agency is part of healing. And I wrote down that quote about that place in her heart was healed through being part of the process. And then what Daniel just said about we should be able to heal without suffering the trauma first. So those two things were very powerful to me. From procedure centered to care centered, I think Laura was saying that. So the dialogue, listening, collaboration, whatever happens gets created with. And it's not that the person is difficult, it's that the process and the system is difficult. And then finally, the thing I took away from that story about the courts was the power of genuine allyship. I think we throw around allyship way too often, but actually what allyship is about intentionally using your power and positionality to see something change. But to be able to do that, you have to do something and you have to give something up. So I was struck by the fact that that lady or that person, she stepped back so others could step in, but she also used her position in that system to fight to get this happening. So I think with allyship, we always think about like what we can do, which is important, but it's also about what we invest to give things up. So those were my reflections. And yeah, just I guess overarching, I just feel moved. You know, I always feel a lot of emotions around when I hear stuff like this, which is when you're working in community, you see things that are getting right. There's so many communities getting things right all of the time. And usually those are the exception to the mainstream systems, but there's so much learning from what these folks are doing. So yeah, thank you to all the speakers, and those are my reflections. Hope they're helpful.
Morgan, thank you for your reflections, but also just for starting the thanks. So we have one more thing we're going to do together, which is just here offer a poll about where this has landed for you. So Jess is going to place that into the chat for you to open up. while that's happening, I really want to express our enormous thanks to John, to Laura, to Ash, to Daniel and to Morgan for sharing and connecting in the way that they have. I also want to take a moment to thank Thea and Jess from the Centre for Public Impact for partnering with the Collective Change Lab to offer this webinar today. And most importantly, I want to thank all of the people that have participated today, given of your time, shared your interest and your hearts to be in this conversation together. So if you're in the Mentimeter, we're going to see live what's sitting with you. This first question, if you're in it, how important a lens do you think trauma is to making progress, social change? So the majority, well, the vast majority is saying very important. Jess, if we can go to the next question. What is your current confidence level in integrating a trauma-informed lens to your social change work? Thank you, everyone. The larger group have some confidence, but would welcome guidance and ideas. And then somewhat even between not sure where to begin and feeling confident to act. Does thinking about trauma at a systems level make sense to you? Do you feel trauma stuck inside systems? Not sure. Largely, yes. And our last question together. To what degree do you think trauma might be contributing to dysfunctional behaviour in the systems you're trying to shift? Not sure. And largely, most people think it's a significant contributor. We'll share this poll. Oh, what would you like to know more about? Here you can type just a few words, a sentence, and we'll see them all. Jess, do you mind also putting my email into the chat, please? So as we close out, we're conscious and wanted to value your time. We're right on the closing time. If you want to remain in this conversation, we are very keen to be in touch with you. So Jess is putting my email address, kerry@collectivechangelab.org, into the chat. Please reach out if you're interested in remaining in this conversation about systemic lens, systemic trauma and collective healing. If you need to go, we thank you for your time, and we also thank you for sharing your thoughts as we close out this webinar. We've covered some pretty emotional ground today, so please go gently with yourself as you get on with your day, and we applaud you all for the work you're doing about trying to transform systems to greater equity and justice. We look forward to being in conversation with you soon.